In the Middle Ages, getting sick was not just uncomfortable, it was terrifying. Before medicine cabinets, hospitals, antibiotics, painkillers, vaccines, or clean surgery, a simple fever could become a warning. A toothache could turn into a deadly infection. A small cut from a rusty tool could slowly darken, swell, and decide a person's fate. And a cough in a crowded village could make everyone wonder who would be buried next. Welcome to Quiet History. Tonight, we step into a world where medicine was part knowledge, part prayer, part superstition, and part desperation. A world where people did not understand germs, where sickness was blamed on bad air, unbalanced humours, sin, curses, or the will of God. They had herbs, they had prayer, they had bloodletting, they had monks, village healers, barber surgeons, and desperate families gathered around candlelit beds, hoping the sickness would pass before the person did. So dim the lights, settle in, and journey back to medieval Europe to discover the terrifying ways people tried to survive sickness when there was no real medicine coming to save them.
Before the antiseptic, before the diagnosis, before the understanding of what a germ actually was, there was simply the body and the world pressing in against it from every direction. That world was cold, damp, and alive with things that could not be seen. It smelled of mud and smoke and animal warmth, and it asked nothing of its inhabitants except endurance. The village streets of late medieval England and the Low Countries were not paved in any modern sense. They were compressed earth, churned by cartwheels and animal hooves into channels of dark mud that held rainwater for days after a storm. Open drainage ditches ran along the edges of the main thoroughfares, carrying away the slow accumulation of household waste, animal dung, and the grey water from cooking and washing. In summer, these channels dried to a crust and released a particular smell, sharp, organic, faintly sweet, in the way that decay can sometimes be sweet, that settled over the village like a second atmosphere. In winter, they filled again and overflowed, and the mud became something closer to a living substance, dark and deep and cold. The thatched rooftops of the cottages held moisture for long periods after rain. The thatch was thick and layered, built up over years of repair and addition, and it harbored insects and small animals in its upper reaches. Below it, the single-room peasant cottage was organized around the central hearth, a raised stone platform, or simply a cleared area of packed earth, where a fire burned almost continuously through the colder months. The smoke from this fire had no chimney to escape through in the earliest of these structures. It rose slowly toward the roof and filtered out through gaps in the thatch, leaving a permanent grey haze in the upper third of the room and coating the rafters with a dark, resinous layer of soot. Everything in the room, the rough woolen blankets folded on the sleeping pallet, the clay pots arranged near the hearth, the bundles of dried herbs hanging from the rafters, carried the smell of that smoke. The floor was covered in rushes or straw, changed periodically, but never truly clean in any modern sense. Dogs moved through the space. In the coldest months, smaller animals might be brought inside at night. The boundary between the human living space and the animal world was permeable and practical, not a matter of hygiene, but of survival. Warmth was warmth, and in a world without insulation or central heating, the body heat of animals was a genuine resource. The smell of the cottage was layered, smoke above, damp earth below, the faint sweetness of drying herbs somewhere in the middle, and underneath all of it, the persistent animal warmth that meant the household was alive and functioning. There was no clean water in the modern sense. Water came from wells, from streams, from collected rainwater, and its quality varied enormously depending on what lay upstream or what had seeped into the ground nearby. It was boiled for some purposes. Ale and pottage required it, but the concept of boiling water specifically to make it safe was not part of the medical framework of this world. Water was simply water. Some of it made people sick. The connection between the water and the sickness was not made in the way a modern mind would make it. There were no sterile surfaces. There was no understanding of infection as a process involving microscopic organisms entering the body and multiplying within it. The knife used to cut bread was the knife used to lance a swelling. The cloth used to bind a wound had been washed in the same water used for everything else. These were not failures of care or attention. They were simply the conditions of the world as it existed before the knowledge that would have made them dangerous was available to anyone. The invisible architecture of this world's medical understanding was built on 4 pillars, and those pillars were called humours. Blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. These 4 substances were believed to govern the entire functioning of the human body, and their balance or imbalance was understood to be the root cause of every state of health and every form of illness. The theory was not invented in the Middle Ages. It had been inherited from ancient Greek medicine, from Hippocrates and Galen, and it had been refined and elaborated over centuries into a coherent and internally consistent framework for understanding the body. It was wrong in its fundamental mechanism, but it was not foolish. It was the best available synthesis of observed patterns, the flushed face of fever, the pale skin of cold illness, the yellow cast of certain infections, the dark melancholy of prolonged sickness. The dark melancholy of prolonged sickness, organized into a system that attempted to explain what the body was doing and why. Each humour was associated with a season, an element, a quality, and a temperament. Blood was warm and moist, associated with spring and air, and an excess of it produced the sanguine temperament, ruddy, energetic, prone to fever. Phlegm was cold and moist, associated with winter and water, and its excess produced the phlegmatic temperament, pale, slow, prone to cold and damp ailments. Pale, slow, prone to cold and damp ailments. Yellow bile was warm and dry, associated with summer and fire, and its excess produced the choleric temperament, irritable, feverish, prone to digestive disturbance. black bile was cold and dry, associated with autumn and earth, and its excess produced the melancholic temperament, dark, heavy, prone to depression and chronic illness. A healthy person was a person in balance. An ill person was a person whose balance had been disrupted, and the task of the healer was to restore that balance by whatever means were available. This framework shaped everything. It shaped the choice of foods recommended during illness, warm, moist foods for cold conditions, cooling foods for fevers. It shaped the timing of medical interventions, which were calibrated to the seasons and to the movements of the planets, which were themselves understood to influence the humors. It shaped the logic of bloodletting, which removed excess blood when blood was judged to be the disrupting humor. It shaped the use of purgatives and emetics, which expelled excess bile. It was a complete system, and within its own terms, it was coherent. The people who used it were not guessing randomly. They were applying a theory. Alongside the humoral framework, and woven through it at every point, was miasma theory, the belief that disease entered the body through bad air. The word miasma came from the Greek for pollution or stain, and the concept was straightforward. Rotting matter, stagnant water, open sewage decaying animal bodies, and the accumulated filth of crowded human habitation all produced a corrupted air that, when breathed, disrupted the humoral balance of the body and caused illness. This theory was also wrong in its mechanism. Disease is not carried by smell, but it was not entirely without observational basis. Places with bad smells were often genuinely dangerous places, not because of the smell itself, but because the conditions that produced the smell also produced the actual vectors of disease. The connection was real, even if the explanation was not. Miasma theory produced a set of practical responses that shaped the physical environment of medieval life in visible ways. Herbs were burned in sick rooms to purify the air. Aromatic plants were strewn on floors and hung in doorways. Windows were sealed against night air, which was believed to be particularly dangerous. The smell of vinegar was thought to counteract miasma, and vinegar-soaked cloths appeared in many contexts of illness and fear. Strong-smelling herbs, rue, wormwood, rosemary, juniper, were carried on the person or burned in the spaces where the sick were tended. The medieval sick room was, as a result, a heavily scented environment. Smoke and herbs and vinegar layered over the underlying smells of illness and unwashed bodies and tallow candles burning low. The village existed within a larger landscape that was itself understood as medically significant. Marshes and fens were known to be dangerous. The people who lived near them suffered more illness, and this was attributed to the bad air rising from the stagnant water. Higher ground was considered healthier. Moving water was safer than still water. The south-facing slope was preferable to the north-facing one. These were not arbitrary beliefs. They were accumulated observations, passed down through generations, that encoded real patterns of disease distribution in the language of miasma and humoral theory. The boundary between the sacred and the medical had not yet been drawn in this world. Illness was not purely a physical event. It was a condition of the whole person, body and soul together, and its causes might include not only humoral imbalance and bad air, but also spiritual disruption, sin, divine testing, demonic influence, or the withdrawal of divine protection. The healer and the priest occupied overlapping territories. The herbs in the cottage rafter and the prayer offered to a healing saint were not competing approaches to illness. They were complementary parts of a single response to suffering, drawn from a world in which the natural and the supernatural were not separate categories. The clay pots of dried herbs hanging from the rafters of the cottage held valerian and betony, feverfew and elder, wormwood and hyssop, plants gathered from hedgerows and field margins and carefully dried through the summer months against the illnesses of winter. Their smell was part of the permanent atmosphere of the room, dusty, slightly bitter, faintly medicinal, mixing with the smoke and the damp and the animal warmth into something that was simply the smell of home. The rough woolen blankets on the sleeping pallet were heavy with use, their fibers matted and dark with age. The straw beneath them rustled with the movement of the sleeper. The hearth fire burned low in the night, its orange light moving slowly across the clay plaster of the walls. This was the world into which illness arrived. Not a world of ignorance, exactly, but a world of different knowledge. Knowledge organized around different principles, expressed in different language, applied through different hands. A world where the body was understood as a small cosmos, subject to the same forces that govern the seasons and the stars. A world where healing was inseparable from prayer, and prayer was inseparable from the smell of herbs and the smell of ferbs, and the smell of herbs was inseparable from the smoke of the hearth fire, and the hearth fire was the center of everything. A world that was doing its best. A world that was always, in its own way, trying to understand. The damp earth smell of the village street settled in the evening air. The thatched rooftops darkened with the coming of night. Somewhere in the cottage, a bundle of dried wormwood turned slowly in the draught from the door, its bitter scent releasing in small, quiet increments into the smoky air. The world rested. The body endured. And in the morning, the work of healing would begin again. The monastery garden existed before the rest of the world woke up. In the grey hour before the first bell called the monks to prayer, the raised beds held their plants in a stillness that felt almost deliberate, as though the garden itself was waiting, patient and purposeful, for the hands that would come to tend it. The mist lay low over the rows of medicinal herbs, softening their edges, beading on the broad leaves of elder and the fine-toothed margins of feverfew. Few, collecting in small cold drops that fell when the air moved. The smell of the garden at this hour was particular and unmistakable. Damp earth beneath everything, and above it the layered medicinal bitterness of wormwood and rue, the faint sweetness of hyssop, the deep earthy weight of valerian root, releasing its scent into the cool air. A monastery garden of the high medieval period was not a casual or accidental space. It was designed with intention, laid out in ordered beds that reflected both practical knowledge and theological conviction, the belief that the natural world, created by God, contained within it the remedies for the suffering that afflicted God's creatures. The beds were raised, edged with timber or woven wattle, filled with soil that had been amended with compost and ash over many years of careful tending. Paths of packed earth ran between them, wide enough for a monk to walk with a basket on his arm. In a well-established monastery garden of the 13th century, it was possible to find more than 400 distinct plants growing in careful, purposeful rows, each one a medicine, each one understood within the framework of humoral theory and accumulated herbal knowledge as possessing specific properties that could act upon the body in specific ways. Valerian grew in the shadier corners, its roots the part most valued. Thick, pale, fibrous roots that, when dried, produced a smell so strong and so particular that it was difficult to describe, except as itself. The roots were used for sleeplessness and for the agitation that accompanied certain fevers, ground and steeped in warm water or wine, and given to those whose bodies could not rest. Feverfew grew in lower, spreading mounds, its small white flowers appearing in summer, its leaves bitter enough to make the mouth contract around them. It was used, as its name suggested, for fevers, and also for the headaches that accompanied them, the crushing pressure behind the eyes that came with high temperature and did not easily yield to anything. Bethany stood taller, its purple flower spikes rising above the surrounding growth, and it was considered one of the most versatile and reliable herbs in the medieval pharmacopoeia, useful for headaches, for digestive complaints, for wounds, for the general category of ailments that resisted more specific classification. Rue occupied its own section of the garden, kept somewhat apart because of its strength. Its blue-green leaves had a sharp, almost acrid smell that clung to the fingers long after handling, and it was understood to be a powerful herb, one that could do harm as well as good if used carelessly. It was used against plague, strewn on floors and burned in sick rooms, and it appeared in many of the complex preparations intended to counteract miasma. Hyssop grew nearby, its narrow leaves and small blue flowers producing a cleaner, more aromatic scent, used for chest ailments and the congestion that accompanied cold and damp illnesses. Elder occupied a larger space than most, a shrub rather than a low herb, its broad, flat flower heads white in summer and its berries dark purple-black in autumn, its bark and flowers and berries all used for different purposes. Preparations of elder bark for swelling and inflammation, elderflower for fevers, the berries for their strengthening properties in the cold months. Wormwood was perhaps the most characteristic smell of the medieval herb garden, a smell that was bitter and complex and slightly resinous, released most strongly when the leaves were bruised or when the plant was cut. It was used primarily for digestive ailments, for the cramping and bloating and general disorder of the stomach and bowel that were common complaints in a world where food preservation was imperfect and waterborne illness was a constant background presence. It was also used against intestinal parasites, which were nearly universal in the medieval population, and it appeared in plague preparations and in the mixtures burned to purify sick rooms. Its smell was the smell of medicine itself in this world, the smell that meant someone was trying to help. The monk who tended this garden moved through it in the early morning with the unhurried attention of long practice. His hands knew the plants by touch as much as by sight, the roughness of betony leaves, the softness of elderflower clusters, the firm resistance of valerian root when pulled from the earth. He worked in silence, or nearly silence, the only sounds the distant bells marking the canonical hours, the movement of birds in the trees beyond the garden wall. Well, the movement of birds in the trees beyond the garden wall, and the quiet sounds of his own labor. The garden was tended as an act of devotion as much as a practical medical resource. The cultivation of healing plants was understood as participation in the divine order of creation, a form of prayer expressed through the hands rather than the voice. The monastery infirmary stood at a slight remove from the main cloister buildings, connected by a covered walkway that kept the sick from the worst of the weather as they were moved between spaces. The infirmary was a long stone room, its walls thick enough to hold some warmth even in the coldest months, its floor laid with flat stones worn smooth by years of foot traffic. Arched windows along one wall admitted the pale grey light of northern European days, and in the winter months, when the light failed early, tallow candles burned in iron holders, fixed to the walls. A large fireplace occupied one end of the room, its hearth wide enough to accommodate several large iron pots simultaneously, and the fire there burned through the day and through the night during periods of serious illness. Along the walls, shelves held the organized accumulation of the infirmarian's work, clay jars sealed with linen and wax, their contents labeled in careful script: dried betony, powdered feverfew, wormwood prepared in vinegar, elder bark steeped in oil. Glass vials held more precious preparations, distilled plant waters, concentrated extracts, the complex compound medicines that required multiple ingredients and long preparation. The smell of the infirmary was the smell of the herb garden, concentrated and intensified. Medicinal bitterness layered over wood smoke, with underneath it the particular smell of illness that no amount of herb burning could entirely displace. The rows of simple wooden beds along the center of the room held their occupants beneath rough woolen blankets, and the infirmarian moved between them with his clay jars and his knowledge and his prayers, which were not separate things, but aspects of a single practice. The works of Hildegard von Bingen, the 12th century abbess and healer, whose writings on natural medicine were among the most comprehensive of the medieval period, described the properties of plants with a specificity and confidence that reflected centuries of accumulated observation. Centuries of accumulated observation. Her Physica documented the uses of betony for headaches and for the confusion that accompanied fever, recommending preparations of the dried herb steeped in warm water and taken in the early morning before food. She described feverfew as useful against the heat of fever, its cooling properties acting on the excess of warm blood that humoral theory identified as the cause of elevated temperature. Helderbark preparations appeared in her writing as treatments for swelling and for the heaviness of limbs that accompanied certain illnesses. Preparations made by boiling the inner bark in water and applying the resulting liquid as a compress to the affected area. Wormwood she described as warming to the stomach, useful against the cold, damp conditions that disrupted digestion, prepared in wine or in honey water and taken in small quantities. Honey appeared throughout medieval herbal medicine as both a medicine in itself and a vehicle for other medicines. Its preservative properties were understood empirically, if not theoretically. Preparations kept in honey lasted longer than those kept in water. Then those kept in water, and its soothing quality on inflamed tissues was widely recognized. Wound dressings of honey mixed with herb preparations appeared in multiple period sources, applied to cuts and abrasions and the edges of surgical wounds, and the results were sometimes genuinely effective, since honey does possess antimicrobial properties that were entirely unknown to those using it, but real nonetheless. Vinegar served a similar dual role as a medicine and as a preservative and purifying agent used to clean wounds, to prepare herbal extracts, and to counteract the miasma believed to surround the sick. The domestic healer space was a different kind of place from the monastery. Infirmary smaller, less organized, more intimate, and in many ways more important, because it was where most ordinary people first encountered medical care. It occupied a corner of the cottage, or sometimes a small lean-to structure attached to the main dwelling, and it was defined by its contents rather than its architecture. Bundles of dried plants hung from the rafters and from wooden pegs driven into the wall, the summer's harvest preserved against winter need. Their colors faded from the bright greens and yellows of the living plant to the muted browns and grays of the dried. An iron mortar and pestle sat on a low wooden table, its interior dark with the accumulated residue of years of grinding, dried roots and seeds, and bark reduced to powder. The powder mixed with honey or oil or vinegar and pressed into clay pots sealed with linen. The woman who kept this space had learned her knowledge from her mother, who had learned it from her mother. Before her, a chain of transmitted knowledge that stretched back through generations of female healers, each one adding her own observations to the accumulated store, each one passing on what had worked and quietly setting aside what had not. This was not a formal education. It had no texts, no examinations, no institutional recognition. It was knowledge carried in the hands and in the memory, expressed in the particular way a plant was prepared, how long it was dried, how finely it was ground, what it was mixed with, how much was given, and how often. It was the true front line of medieval medicine, the place where most ordinary illness was first addressed, and it was largely the domain of women. Vervain grew in the cottage garden alongside the vegetables, its small purple flowers appearing in midsummer, and it was used to bring down fevers, steeped in water and given in small doses through the day. Juniper berries were kept in a clay pot on the shelf, used in preparations for childbirth complications, their sharp resinous smell releasing when the pot was opened. Pennyroyal, a small creeping mint, with a strong medicinal smell, appeared in preparations intended to assist difficult labors. Bugloss and chicory and endive were kept against the fear of plague, their cooling properties understood within the humoral framework as counteracting the hot, corrupt air that carried pestilence. Rosewater distilled from the petals of the cottage, rose in early summer, was used to moderate the strength of more powerful preparations, to cool down the heat of wormwood, or aniseed, to make a bitter medicine more tolerable, to soothe the skin around a wound. The textures of this world of plant medicine were as specific and as present as its smells. The dusty bitterness of dried wormwood crumbled between the fingers into a fine grey-green powder that left its smell on the skin for hours. The sharp sweetness of dried elderflower was lighter, more delicate, releasing in a brief bright note when the dried clusters were disturbed. The earthy weight of valerian root was dense and fibrous, resistant to the mortar, requiring sustained effort to reduce to a workable consistency. Betony leaves, dried to a papery thinness, broke apart with a soft sound and released a faint, slightly astringent smell that was neither pleasant nor unpleasant, but simply medicinal. The smell of something that was meant to do something, that had a purpose beyond its own existence. The clay pots on the shelf held the accumulated labor of seasons, the early morning hours in the garden, the long afternoons of drying and sorting, the careful work of grinding and mixing and sealing. Each pot represented a decision made. Each pot represented a decision made within the framework of available knowledge. This plant for this ailment, prepared in this way, given in this quantity. The decisions were not always correct by any standard that would be recognized today. But they were not random. They were the product of careful observation, of inherited wisdom, of genuine attention to the patterns of illness and recovery that played out in the bodies of the people this healer served. The monastery garden held its silence as the morning advanced. The mist lifted slowly from the raised beds, and the pale light of the northern morning settled over the ordered rows of medicinal plants. The wormwood and the rue, the elder and the betony, the feverfew and the hyssop and the valerian. The smell of damp earth and medicinal leaves drifted on the still air. Somewhere beyond the garden wall, the first bell of the day rang, and the monastery came slowly to life around its quiet center. The garden waited as it always waited, patient, purposeful, full of remedies that were imperfect and genuine and entirely human in their reach toward healing. Fever arrived without announcement. It came in the night most often, a warmth behind the eyes that deepened into pressure, a heaviness in the limbs that made the rough wool blanket feel suddenly unbearable, and then, moments later, necessary and not enough. The body turned against its own temperature, and the world of the sick room contracted to the dimensions of a single pallet, a single candle flame, a single night that seemed to have no end. The sick room in a medieval cottage was not a separate room in any modern sense. It was the same single space where the household cooked and ate and slept. Reorganized around the needs of the ill person, the pallet moved closer to the hearth, the other members of the household shifting their patterns of movement and rest to accommodate the new center of gravity that serious illness created. The pallet itself was a simple wooden frame, strung with rope or leather strips, covered with a layer of straw that had been refreshed as recently as the household could manage, and over that straw, a rough linen sheet, and then the heavy wool blanket, dark with age and use. Its fibers matted into a dense, slightly felted surface that held warmth well, but breathed poorly. The sick person lay within this arrangement and became, for the duration of the illness, the still center around which everything else moved. The hearth fire was managed with particular attention during a fever. The humoral understanding of fever held that it represented an excess of hot, moist blood, the sanguine humor in dangerous overabundance, heating the body beyond its natural balance. The fire, therefore, needed to be maintained at a level that kept the room warm enough to prevent the additional disruption of cold and damp, but not so hot that it added to the excess heat, already disturbing the sick person's balance. This was a careful calibration, made by feel and by long experience, and it required someone to tend the fire through the night, feeding it small amounts of wood at intervals, banking it when it burned too high, coaxing it when it threatened to sink too low. The orange light of the hearth fire moved constantly across the clay plaster walls, its shadows shifting with each small adjustment of the fuel. And this movement was one of the defining visual qualities of the sick room at night. A room that was never entirely still, never entirely dark. Near the embers, set close enough to stay warm, but not so close as to boil away, sat the clay pot of herb-steeped water. It had been prepared before the household settled for the night. Water drawn from the well and brought to a boil over the fire, then removed from the direct heat and packed with dried betony and feverfew, the pot covered with a folded piece of linen to hold the steam and the medicinal properties within. By the time the water had cooled to a temperature that could be used, it had taken on the color of weak tea and the smell of the herbs themselves, slightly bitter, slightly green, the smell of something that was meant to help. A small clay cup sat beside the pot, and through the night it was filled and offered to the sick person at intervals, small amounts, frequently given. The warmth of the liquid understood to carry the properties of the herbs directly into the body's interior, where the humoral imbalance needed to be addressed. Betony was the primary herb in this preparation, as it was in most fever treatments of the period. Its properties were understood within the humoral framework as moderating, capable of acting on the excess that caused illness without introducing a new excess in the opposite direction. Feverfew was added for its cooling quality, its ability to reduce the heat of the blood without chilling the body into the opposite imbalance of cold and damp. The combination was a considered one, reflecting the internal logic of humoral medicine. Two herbs whose properties complemented each other, working together toward the restoration of balance rather than the aggressive suppression of a single symptom. Cool linen cloths steeped in herb water were laid across the forehead of the sick person and across the wrists, where the pulse could be felt beating too fast and too hard beneath the skin. The cloths were wrung out and reapplied as they warmed, replaced with fresh ones from the clay pot beside the hearth. The cold of the water, a brief relief against the heat of the skin, before the body's temperature reasserted itself, and the cloth warmed again. The hands that performed this task moved with the quiet efficiency of practice, not hurried, not distressed, simply present and attentive, doing what could be done. The touch of cool linen on a fevered forehead was one of the most consistent acts of medieval care, repeated in cottage and monastery infirmary alike. Fire, repeated in cottage and monastery infirmary alike. Its mechanism, misunderstood, but its comfort, real. Aromatic herbs were burned in the sick room to address the miasma concern that accompanied any serious illness. A small clay dish near the hearth held a smouldering mixture of dried rosemary and juniper, their smoke rising in thin pale threads that drifted through the room and settled into the wool blankets and the straw of the pallet and the hair of everyone present. The smell of this burning was sharp and resinous, cleaner than the ordinary smoke of the hearth fire, more deliberate, carrying with it the intention of purification. The belief that bad air had contributed to the onset of illness meant that clearing the air of the sick room was understood as a genuine medical intervention, not a ritual gesture, but a practical one, aimed at removing the miasmatic cause and preventing the illness from worsening or spreading to others in the household. On the wall above the pallet, a small wooden cross hung from a wooden peg, driven into the clay plaster. It was simple, 2 pieces of dark wood, bound together with cord, and it had hung in that position for years, its surface worn smooth where hands had touched it. Beside it, or sometimes tucked beneath the edge of the pallet where the sick person could reach it, was a small object of devotional significance, a piece of cloth that had touched a relic, a small wax figure of a saint, a dried sprig of a plant associated with a particular protector. These objects were not decorative. They were understood as active participants in the process of healing, physical points of contact between the suffering body and the spiritual forces that governed recovery and death. Illness in the medieval understanding was never purely a physical event. The body and the soul were not separate territories, and what afflicted one affected the other. Fever could be the body's humoral crisis, yes, but it could also be a test sent by God, a purification of the soul through the suffering of the flesh, or a consequence of some spiritual disorder that expressed itself in physical form. This understanding did not make the suffering less real or the care less genuine. It simply placed the suffering within a larger framework of meaning, one that gave the sick person a role to play beyond passive endurance, and gave the illness itself a purpose beyond mere biological disruption. The person lying on the pallet was not simply a body fighting an infection. They were a soul moving through an experience that had spiritual dimensions as well as physical ones. Small prayers were offered through the night to saints associated with specific ailments. Saint Blaise was invoked for throat ailments, which often accompanied the fevers of winter illness. Saint Roch was called upon in times of plague fear, his image sometimes kept in the sick room during any serious fever as a precaution against the worst possibility. Prague, time equal sign, 900 milliketsins. The Virgin Mary was invoked more broadly, as a mother whose compassion extended to all suffering, Exapeia, and her name appeared in the quiet prayers offered over the clay cup of herb water before it was given to the sick person, a blessing that was simultaneously a medical preparation and a devotional act, the two dimensions inseparable in the mind and practice of the person performing it. The quality of darkness in a medieval room at night was different from any darkness that most modern people encounter. The single tallow candle burning on the shelf near the pallet produced a small, warm circle of light that did not reach the corners of the room. The hearth fire added its own shifting illumination, but it too left large areas of the room in a darkness that was dense and complete. The clay plaster walls absorbed the light rather than reflecting it, their rough surface catching the candlelight in small highlights and letting the rest fall into shadow. The rafters above were invisible. Lost in the darkness above the candle's reach, the bundles of dried herbs hanging from them suggested rather than seen, their presence known by smell rather than by sight. The room existed in a state of partial visibility that was its natural condition, and the sick person lying on the pallet inhabited this partial darkness as their entire world. The sound of the sick person's breathing was the sound that organized the night. In the early hours of a fever, the breathing was fast and shallow, the chest rising and falling with a rapidity that was itself a sign of the body's disturbance. Time equals sign, 900 milliseconds. As the night deepened and the herb preparations were given and the cool cloths were applied and the prayers were offered, the breathing sometimes slowed, not always, not reliably, but sometimes, and the slowing was watched for with the attention of someone who understood that it meant something. The person tending the sick listened to that breathing the way a navigator listens to wind, reading it for information, for direction, for the small signs that might indicate which way the night was moving. Wind moved through the thatched roof above with a sound that was not quite a sound, more a presence, a shifting in the quality of the air, a faint rustling from the layers of straw above that suggested the world outside continuing its own business, regardless of what was happening within. Rain, when it came, produced a heavier sound, a sustained percussion on the thatch that deepened as the storm intensified, and then gradually softened as it passed. The sick person heard these sounds from within the fever, and they were part of the texture of the experience, the world outside the body continuing its ordinary rhythms, while the body itself moved through something extraordinary. The smell of the sick room through the long night was layered and specific. Wood smoke from the hearth was always present, its familiar quality, a kind of constant beneath everything else. The burning rosemary and juniper added their sharper note, resinous and clean. The herb-steeped water in the clay pot released its bitterness into the warm air near the embers. The damp wool of the blanket had its own smell, the smell of wet animal fiber, of long use, of warmth held and released and held again. And beneath all of it, the smell of illness itself, something slightly sweet, slightly sour, the particular smell of a body working hard against something it could not see or name. When the fever broke, it broke with sweat, a sudden dampening of the skin that soaked through the linen sheet and into the straw beneath, and that was understood within the humoral framework as the body expelling the excess that had caused the disruption. The sweating was watched for and welcomed. The damp linen changed as quickly as the household's resources allowed. The sick person's skin dried with a clean cloth and covered again with a heavy blanket. The breaking of a fever was not the end of illness. Recovery was slow, the body depleted by the effort, the appetite absent for days afterward. But the breaking of the fever was the turning point, the moment when the night began to move toward morning, when the prayers shifted from petition to gratitude. Not every fever broke. This was the knowledge that sat beneath the entire practice of the sick room, the knowledge that the herbs and the cool cloths and the prayers and the careful management of the fire were not guarantees. They were offerings. They were the full extent of what could be done given to the sick person with genuine care and genuine hope, and then the outcome was in other hands. The medieval relationship with illness was shaped by this knowledge at its deepest level. The conned knowledge that doing everything right was not the same as ensuring recovery, that the body had its own trajectory, that care could influence but not control. The candle burned lower through the night, its flame shrinking as the tallow was consumed. The circle of light it cast, growing smaller and warmer as the hours passed. The hearth fire settled into its banked nighttime state, its glow steady and orange and low. The clay pot of herb water sat near the embers, still warm, its surface still releasing the faint bitterness of betony and feverfew into the quiet air. The wooden cross on the wall caught the candlelight on its worn surface and held it for a moment before the flame shifted and the light moved on. The sick room breathed with the breathing of its occupant, and the night continued its slow passage toward whatever morning would bring. Outside, the village was dark and still. The thatched rooftops held their moisture against the cold air. The mud of the street was frozen at its surface, the drainage channels quiet. Somewhere in the darkness, a bundle of dried wormwood hung from a rafter and turned slowly in the draught, its bitter smell releasing in small quiet increments into the smoky air of a cottage where someone lay still beneath a heavy blanket, breathing, enduring, waiting for the long night to end. There, waiting for the long night to end, the striped pole stood outside a narrow townhouse on a busy market street, its colors faded by weather and years of exposure to the particular grey light of northern European days. Red and white wound in a slow spiral, from top to bottom, the red representing blood, the white representing the linen bandages, used to bind the wounds that followed. It was one of the most recognizable objects in the medieval townscape, a sign that needed no words to communicate its meaning. Everyone who passed it understood what happened inside. Everyone who passed it had, at some point, needed what was offered there. The street outside was alive with the ordinary noise of a medieval market day. The movement of animals and carts, the calls of traders, the sound of feet on compressed earth, the smell of food cooking somewhere nearby, mixing with the smell of animals and refuse, and the particular sharp note of iron and blood that drifted from the open doorway of the barber-surgeon's shop. That smell was the first thing a person encountered before they even crossed the threshold. Iron and blood and tallow and something faintly medicinal beneath it all, beneath it all. The smell of a place where the body was regularly opened and addressed and bound back together. It was not a pleasant smell, but it was a purposeful one. And in this world, purpose was its own kind of reassurance. The interior of the shop was small and low-ceilinged, its walls of dark timber and clay plaster, absorbing what little light came through the single window that faced the street. The floor was packed earth, covered in places with straw that had been darkened by use and by the slow accumulation of what the work of this place produced. A tallow candle burned on a shelf near the window, its flame steady in the still air of the interior, its light warm and amber and insufficient, casting more shadow than illumination across the objects arranged around the room. A hearth at the back of the space held a small fire, and in the embers of that fire, certain iron tools were kept warm, not for comfort, but for the specific purpose of cauterization, which required heat to be effective. The chair occupied the center of the room. It was a heavy wooden structure, its seat and back worn smooth by years of contact with the bodies of those who had sat in it. The wood darkened and polished by that contact to a deep, almost black surface that held the light of the candle in a faint sheen. Its arms were wide and flat, designed to support the arm of a seated person in a position that exposed the inner elbow or the wrist, the sites most commonly used for bloodletting. The chair was not designed for comfort, exactly, but it was designed for the work it supported. And that design was the result of long practical refinement. It was the most important object in the room, the center around which everything else was organized. On a shelf against the wall, the tools of the barber-surgeon's practice were arranged with a care that reflected their importance. Lancets, small narrow-bladed instruments with bone handles worn smooth by use, sat in a row, their edges maintained with a whetstone that rested beside them. Fleens, broader-bladed instruments used for larger incisions in bloodletting, lay beside the lancets, their handles darker and heavier. Bone-handled knives of varying sizes occupied the middle of the shelf, used for wound debridement, for the removal of damaged tissue, for the more invasive interventions that the barber surgeon was called upon to perform. At the end of the shelf, the cauterizing irons rested in a ceramic holder, thick iron rods with flattened or pointed ends, their surfaces darkened by repeated heating and use, objects whose purpose was immediately legible from their form. A ceramic bleeding bowl sat on the low table beside the chair, its interior stained with the dark residue of its use, its rim worn where hands had gripped it. Beside it, a basin of water had gone dark. The water changed regularly, but never quite returning to clarity, the basin itself carrying the permanent faint stain of its purpose. Bundles of linen for binding lay, folded on a second shelf, their surfaces clean, relative to everything else in the room, their whiteness the brightest thing in the space. The linen was the last step in most procedures. The wrapping that contained the wound held the poultice in place, applied the pressure that slowed bleeding after the lancet had done its work. The barber surgeon occupied a particular and somewhat ambiguous position in the medical hierarchy of the medieval world. Formally trained physicians, those who had studied at the universities of Salerno or Paris or Bologna, who had read Galen and Avicenna and could discourse on the humoral theory with scholarly precision, did not perform surgery. The Fourth Lateran Council of 1215 had issued a papal edict forbidding clergy from performing surgical procedures on the grounds that contact with blood and body fluids was contaminating to men of Robbie, the church, and since most formally trained physicians of the period were clergy, this effectively separated surgery from learned medicine. The barber surgeon filled the space that this separation created, a practitioner who worked with his hands rather than his books, whose knowledge was transmitted through apprenticeship rather than university study, and who performed the physical interventions that the learned physician would not touch. Most people in the medieval world never saw a formally trained physician. The physician was an urban figure, expensive and inaccessible to the majority of the population, whose services were available primarily to those with the means to pay for them. The barber surgeon was something different, present in towns and larger villages, accessible to a broader range of people, combining the cutting of hair and the trimming of beards with the full range of surgical interventions that the medieval body might require. This combination of services was not accidental or arbitrary. It reflected the practical reality that the tools of the barber, sharp blades, skilled hands, a tolerance for the physical intimacy of working on another person's body, were the same tools required for surgical work, and that the two practices shared a physical and economic logic that made their combination sensible. Bloodletting was the central medical intervention of this world, and the barber surgeon was its primary practitioner. The theory behind it was straightforward within the humoral framework. If illness was caused by an excess of blood, the hot, moist humor associated with fever and inflammation and the sanguine overabundance that produced flushed skin and rapid pulse, then removing some of that blood would reduce the excess and restore the body toward balance. The logic was internally consistent, and it was applied with considerable sophistication. The amount of blood to be removed, the site from which it was taken, and the timing of the procedure were all governed by careful considerations drawn from humoral theory, from seasonal calendars, and from the elaborate astrological charts that mapped the influence of planetary positions on the different parts of the body. The most common method was the lancet cut at the inner elbow or the wrist, a small, precise incision that opened a vein and allowed blood to flow into the ceramic bowl held beneath. The barber surgeon watched the flow with practiced attention, judging the quantity by the color and consistency of the blood as much as by volume, dark as much as by volume. Dark, thick blood, suggesting one kind of humoral imbalance, bright red and thin, suggesting another. When the appropriate amount had been collected, the incision was pressed closed with a folded linen cloth and bound firmly, the pressure maintained until the bleeding slowed and stopped. The entire procedure was performed with a matter-of-fact efficiency that reflected its ordinary. This was not an exceptional intervention, but a routine one, performed on healthy people as a preventive measure, as readily as on the sick. Leeches offered an alternative method of bloodletting that required less skill with the blade and produced a more diffuse, gentler extraction. They were kept in a clay jar of water on the shelf beside the lancets, their dark bodies moving slowly in the water and they were applied directly to the skin at the site where blood removal was desired. The leech's bite was nearly painless. Its saliva contained a substance that prevented clotting and numbed the skin, and it fed until it was engorged and fell away of its own accord, having removed a small, controlled quantity of blood. For conditions affecting the face or the scalp, where a lancet cut would be difficult and conspicuous, leeches were particularly useful, and they appeared in the treatment of headaches, eye inflammation, and the congestion of the sinuses that accompanied winter fevers. Cupping was the third method, using heated glass or ceramic vessels applied to the skin to draw blood or fluid toward the surface without breaking it, or, in wet cupping, applied after small incisions had been made to draw blood out through the cuts. The cups were heated by holding a flame inside them briefly, then pressed quickly against the skin. Colder, where the cooling air inside created a suction that pulled the skin upward into the vessel. The marks left by cupping were distinctive, circular bruises that darkened over the following days. Their color is already setting in. Their color interpreted within the humoral framework as evidence of the corrupt matter that had been drawn to the surface and expelled. The back and the shoulders were the most common sites for cupping, the broad, flat surfaces there accommodating multiple cups simultaneously. Wound treatment occupied another significant portion of the barber surgeon's practice. Time equal sign, 900 millikets. The wounds that arrived at his door were the wounds of a world without safety, equipment, without adequate lighting, without the protective distance from physical danger that modern life provides. Cuts from agricultural tools, injuries from animal handling, wounds from the ordinary violence of a world where physical conflict was more common and more accepted than it would later become. The cleaning of wounds was performed with wine or vinegar, not because anyone understood the antimicrobial properties of alcohol or acetic acid, but because these substances were understood within the humoral framework as possessing warming, drying properties that counteracted the cold. Damp corruption believed to cause wound infection. The result was sometimes genuinely effective, the alcohol in wine and the acidity of vinegar reducing bacterial contamination through mechanisms entirely unknown to those applying them. Honey and herb poultices were applied to cleaned wounds and bound in place with linen strips. The honey sealed the wound surface against the air, against the miasma that was believed to enter through open wounds and cause the dark, shippened, swelling corruption that followed untreated injuries, while the herbs in the poultice addressed the humoral imbalance of the wound itself. Preparations of betony and plantain and comfrey appeared regularly in wound poultices, their properties understood as promoting the knitting of tissue and the resolution of inflammation. The linen binding was changed at intervals, the wound inspected for signs of the corruption that everyone feared, the darkening of the surrounding skin, the heat and swelling that indicated the process had begun, the smell that accompanied advanced infection. When corruption was already established, or when a wound was bleeding in a way that could not be controlled by pressure alone. The cauterizing iron was brought from the embers of the hearth. Its surface glowed dull orange in the dim light of the shop, and it was applied quickly and firmly to the affected tissue, the heat sealing blood vessels, destroying the corrupted matter, creating a barrier of burned tissue that was understood to prevent the further spread of infection. The pain of cauterization was severe, and there was nothing in the barber surgeon's practice that meaningfully addressed it. A cloth soaked in a preparation of henbane or mandrake might be offered beforehand. Plants whose sedative properties were recognized empirically, whose effect was real if unpredictable, but the procedure itself was performed through the patient's endurance, which was understood as both a practical necessity and a form of the suffering that illness and its treatment required. Tooth extraction was among the most common and most dreaded of the barber surgeon's procedures. The dental health of the medieval population was poor by any measure, a diet high in coarse grain and low in the variety that might have provided some protection, combined with no systematic dental care, produced teeth that decayed and abscessed with regularity, and the pain of a severe toothache was one of the most common acute complaints that brought people to the barber surgeon's chair. The instrument used for extraction was the dental pelican, or the dental key, a lever-action device with a curved claw that hooked over the crown of the tooth. The device then rotated against the gum to apply the force needed to break the tooth free from its socket. The wooden chair was essential here. The patient needed something solid to brace against, and the barber surgeon needed the patient to remain as still as possible during the procedure. The absence of effective anesthetic was the defining condition of all surgical practice in this world. The henbane preparation helped some patients into a state of reduced awareness, and wine taken in quantity before a procedure dulled the edge of sensation without eliminating it. But the fundamental reality of the barber surgeon's work was that it was performed on conscious people experiencing the full sensation of what was being done to them, and the skill of the practitioner was measured in part by the speed with which he could complete a procedure, speed being the most effective available form of mercy. The sounds of the barber surgeon's shop were the sounds of this reality: the scrape of iron on bone, the quick intake of breath, the silence that followed the completion of a procedure and preceded the application of the binding linen. The iron tools on the shelf held the full weight of this world's relationship, with physical suffering and physical intervention. Their surfaces were worn where hands had gripped them through years of use, the bone handles of the lancets smooth and slightly yellowed, the iron of the cauterizing rods darkened by repeated heating to a surface that was almost black. They were simple objects, their forms determined entirely by function, without ornament or decoration of any kind. A lancet was a lancet, a blade small enough to make a controlled incision, a handle large enough to hold securely, nothing more. A cauterizing iron was a rod of iron with a working end shaped to the purpose for which it was most commonly used. Their simplicity was not a limitation, so much as a clarity. These were objects that knew exactly what they were for. The ceramic bleeding bowl on the table beside the chair had been filled and emptied more times than anyone could count. Its interior staining told that history in the language of accumulated use. The dark rings left by blood that had dried before the bowl was washed, the faint discoloration that no washing could entirely remove. It was an ordinary object made significant by its function, by the number of times it had received what the body was persuaded to give up in the name of restoration and balance. The basin of dark water beside it held the same accumulated history in a different form. The water that had cleaned the tools, rinsed the wounds, received the residue of the work. The barber surgeon himself was a figure shaped by his practice. Hands that had developed the particular calluses of tool use. Eyes trained to read the color and consistency of blood and the appearance of wounds with a diagnostic precision that existed entirely outside any formal theoretical framework. His knowledge was embodied knowledge, carried in the hands and the eyes rather than in texts, transmitted through years of apprenticeship in which observation and repetition built a competence that was genuine within its own terms. He was doing what Hippocrates had recognized centuries before, that surgery required dedicated training, that the skills of the knife could only be developed through sustained practice, that the healer who worked with his hands occupied a distinct and necessary place in the spectrum of care. The striped pole outside turned slowly in the wind that moved along the market street, its faded colors catching the gray light of the afternoon. Inside, the tallow candle burned steadily on its shelf, its amber light moving across the worn surface of the wooden chair, across the shelf of iron tools, across the ceramic bowl and the basin of dark water and the folded linen waiting on its shelf. The smell of iron and blood and tallow drifted through the open doorway and mixed with the smell of the street outside, the mud and the animals and the cooking food and the ordinary accumulation of a market day. The shop waited, as it always waited, for the next person who would cross its threshold and lower themselves into the worn wooden chair and offer their body to the full extent of what this world knew how to do. The iron tools is already setting in. The iron tools rested on their shelf in the quiet of the late afternoon, their surfaces holding the warmth of the room, their worn forms carrying the accumulated weight of every procedure they had performed and every body they had touched. They were the full reach of physical intervention in this world, and they were also its full limit, the place where the knowledge stopped and the outcome passed into other hands. The candle flame held steady. The half fire glowed low and orange in the back of the room. Outside, the market street continued its ordinary noise, and the striped pole turned in the wind, and the world went on. The silence arrived before the plague did. It settled over the village street like a change in weather, a gradual withdrawal of the ordinary sounds of market day, the absence of voices where voices should have been, the closed shutters on houses that were normally open to the morning air. Something had changed in the quality of the world, and everyone who walked that street felt it in the particular way that human beings feel the approach of something they cannot yet name, but already, somewhere beneath conscious thought, already know. The smell of the street had changed as well. Beneath the ordinary layers of mud and animal presence and cooking smoke, something sharper had been introduced. The acrid bite of burning vinegar, the resinous smoke of aromatic wood smouldering in clay dishes set outside doorways, the particular bitter note of rue and wormwood strewn across thresholds and scattered on the packed earth of the street itself. These were the smells of fear expressed through the available vocabulary of miasma theory, the belief that bad air carried disease, and that bad air carried disease, purified by fire and strong-smelling herbs, could drive the corruption away. Every household that had heard the rumors from the neighboring town had responded in the same way, because the response was the same everywhere. Drawn from the same framework of understanding that shaped every other aspect of medical practice in this world. The Black Death, which swept through Europe beginning in the late 1340s, reached mortality rates as high as 75% in some areas, according to documented historical accounts of the pandemic. By 1353, it had spread throughout most of Europe, across Asia, and into North Africa, killing in numbers that had no precedent in living memory, and that strained the capacity of every institution, medical, religious, civic, to respond. The physicians of the period were reliant on medical techniques and theories that dated back to Aristotle and Hippocrates in the 4th century before the Common Era, and those techniques had no mechanism for addressing what Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for plague, actually did inside the human body. The cause was invisible and would remain so for centuries. What was visible was the dying, and the dying was everywhere. The village street in the weeks before plague arrived, during the period of rumor and approach, when the disease was known to be in the next county or the next town, but had not yet crossed the threshold of this particular community, had a quality that was distinct from any other kind of fear. It was not the acute fear of a visible threat, but the sustained low-frequency dread of something that could not be seen or heard or smelled in itself, only in the responses it provoked. The closed shutters were a response. The burning herbs were a response. The absence of the market, the withdrawal of people from shared spaces, the sealing of windows with cloth soaked in vinegar, all of these were responses to something that had not yet arrived, preparations made against an enemy whose nature was misunderstood, but whose effects were known with terrible precision. Bonfires of aromatic wood were lit at the corners of streets in towns where plague had been confirmed or strongly suspected. The wood chosen was selected for its smell: juniper and rosemary and pine, woods whose burning produced a thick, far, resinous smoke that was understood to counteract a miasma, believed to carry the disease. The fires burned through the day, and sometimes through the night, their smoke drifting through the streets and settling into the clothing and hair of anyone who passed nearby. The smell of the burning following people into their homes and into their sleep. The light of these fires at night gave the plague-threatened town a particular visual quality. Orange light moving against dark buildings, smoke rising in pale columns against the darker sky. The ordinary street transformed into something that looked, from a distance, like a place already in the process of some profound alteration. Pomanders were carried by those who could afford them, small perforated balls of wax or metal, packed with aromatic spices and herbs, held to the nose when moving through public spaces, or when proximity to the sick was unavoidable. The spices used in pomanders were expensive: cloves, nutmeg, ambergris, musk, and their cost meant that this particular protection was available primarily to those with resources. A pomander was held between the fingers and raised to the face, its perforations releasing the concentrated smell of its contents in a small personal cloud of purified air that its user breathed in place of the corrupted atmosphere of the street. The gesture of holding a pomander to the nose became, during periods of plague, one of the defining visual images of the wealthy moving through a dangerous world. A small sphere of spice held between gloved fingers, the face turned slightly away from the street, the body moving quickly through spaces that felt suddenly, irreversibly threatening. Ruined wormwood appeared on every threshold. Their bitter smell was understood as specifically antagonistic to the miasma of plague. Their properties, within the humoral framework, counteracting the hot, corrupt quality of the air that carried the disease. Floors were strewn with them, the dried plants crushed underfoot, releasing their smell in small bursts with each footstep, so that moving through a plague-fearing household meant walking on a carpet of medicinal bitterness that released its scent continuously into the air of the room. Windows were sealed with cloth soaked in vinegar, the vinegar's sharp acidity understood as purifying, its smell a barrier against the corruption that might otherwise enter with the air. The sealed window changed the quality of light inside the room, the cloth filtering the daylight to a dimmer, more diffuse illumination that gave the interior a quality of suspension, as though the household had withdrawn from ordinary time into a state of waiting. The monastery responded to plague with the organizational resources that its institutional structure provided. The sick were isolated in separate rooms, not because anyone understood contagion in the modern sense, but because the concentration of miasma around the sick was understood to be dangerous to those nearby, and separation reduced the exposure of the healthy to the corrupted air that surrounded the ill. This response, arrived at through entirely incorrect reasoning, had the practical effect of reducing transmission in ways that the monks who implemented it could not have explained and did not understand. The belongings of those who died were burned, their blankets and clothing, and the straw of their pallets, fed to a fire in the monastery courtyard. Fed to a fire in the monastery courtyard. The smoke rising in a dark column that was visible from the village below. The burning was understood as purification, the destruction of the miasmatic material that had accumulated around the dead body during its illness, the fire completing the work of separation that isolation had begun. The infirmary during plague was a different space from the infirmary of ordinary illness. The smell was heavier, the burning herbs more numerous and more constant, the vinegar-soaked cloths present on every surface, the smoke of rosemary and juniper thicker in the air than it would normally be. The monks who tended the sick moved through this atmosphere with cloths held over their faces, the cloth soaked in vinegar or in preparations of strong-smelling herbs, their eyes above the cloth carrying the particular expression of people performing an act of care that they understood might cost them their lives. Many of them died. Break. Time equals sign, 900 milliseconds. The monastic communities of Europe lost significant portions of their populations to the Black Death, the very proximity to the sick that their vocation required, making them among the most vulnerable. They continued their work regardless, because the work was inseparable from the vocation, and the vocation was inseparable from who they were. The plague burial ground occupied a space at the edge of consecrated earth. Long trenches dug in the dark soil. Long trenches dug in the dark soil. Their dimensions determined by the number of bodies that needed to be received rather than by any individual consideration of the dead. The earth here was heavy and cold, the clay of it resisting the spades of the gravediggers with a dull persistence that made the work slow and exhausting. Simple wooden crosses marked the filled sections of the trenches, their surfaces unpainted and already beginning to grey with exposure to weather, their forms identical and closely spaced in a way that communicated more clearly than any inscription could the scale of what had happened. The silence of the burial ground was different from the silence of the village street. It was not the silence of withdrawal or waiting, but the silence of completion, of something that had run its course and left behind only the evidence of its passage. The dance macabre, the dance of death, appeared on the walls of churches and charnel houses throughout late medieval Europe. In the decades following the Black Death, its imagery a direct response to the experience of mass mortality that the plague had produced. The paintings depicted a procession in which skeletal figures led the living, pope and peasant, king and child, merchant and monk, in a dance that acknowledged no distinction of rank or wealth or virtue. Death came for everyone, in the same order, with the same inevitability. And the paintings made this visible in a way that was not morbid so much as honest, an acknowledgement of a truth that the plague had made impossible to ignore. The walls of the church that bore these images were cold stone, their painted surfaces catching the candlelight in the particular way that flat pigment on plaster catches light, absorbing some and reflecting back a slightly different quality. The colors muted and earthy, the figures moving in their painted procession through the dim interior of the nave. Small shrines to plague saints occupied corners of churches and roadside niches throughout the affected regions. Saint Sebastian, whose martyrdom by arrows was understood as an image of the plagues, random, penetrating assault on the body, was depicted in paintings and small carved figures throughout this period. His bound form, his upturned face, the arrows embedded in his flesh. The arrows embedded in his flesh, all understood as images of intercession rather than suffering. The saint's endurance a model and a protection for those who prayed before him. Saint Roch, who according to tradition had himself survived plague and had tended the sick during an outbreak in Italy, was depicted showing the bubo on his thigh, the swollen lymph node that was the most visible sign of bubonic plague, and this image of the saint displaying his own wound was understood as evidence of his particular authority to intercede for those afflicted with the same condition. Time equals sign, 900 milliseconds. Before these shrines, small offerings accumulated, wax figures representing the afflicted body parts, linen bundles containing prayers written on scraps of parchment, dried herbs bound with cord, the small material expressions of hope that people brought when they had nothing else to bring. The spatial and visual language of plague memorialization transformed the physical environment of late medieval Europe in ways that persisted long after the immediate crisis had passed. The charnel houses built to receive the bones of the plague dead became architectural features of the landscape around churches and monasteries. Low stone buildings whose walls sometimes incorporated the bones themselves into decorative arrangements. The skulls and long bones of the dead organized into patterns that were simultaneously macabre and devotional, a permanent reminder of the community of the dead that surrounded and outnumbered the living. The presence of death as a constant, visible, architectural feature of the medieval world was not a sign of morbidity, but of a different relationship with mortality, one in which the dead remained present in the landscape of the living, their bones visible and their memory maintained through the ongoing practice of prayer and remembrance. The measures taken against plague, the quarantines, the border lockdowns, the isolation of the sick, the burning of belongings, represented a form of public health response that was arrived at through incorrect reasoning, but was not without practical effect. The instinct to separate the sick from the healthy, to restrict movement during outbreaks, to destroy the material environment of the dead. These responses, drawn from the logic of miasma theory and the accumulated experience of watching what happened when they were and were not implemented, laid groundwork for later, better understood practices of epidemic control. The Black Death served, as historians of medicine have documented, to promote medical innovations that laid the foundations of modern medicine, not because anyone understood what they were doing in terms that would be recognizable today, But because the scale of the crisis forced a confrontation with the limits of existing knowledge and created pressure for new approaches, the monastery herb garden at dusk held its quiet with the same patience it had always held. The raised beds of medicinal plants continued their slow seasonal growth, regardless of what was happening in the world beyond the garden wall. Beyond the garden wall, the wormwood putting out its grey-green leaves, the rue spreading its blue-green mounds, the elder extending its branches toward the fading light. The smell of the garden at this hour was the smell of the garden at this hour, damp earth and medicinal bitterness and the faint sweetness of hyssop drifting on the evening air. The plants did not know about the plague. They grew because growing was what they did, and they offered what they had always offered, the imperfect, genuine, entirely human medicine of the herb garden, the accumulated knowledge of generations, expressed in the careful arrangement of roots and leaves and flowers in ordered beds of dark soil. The persistence of the healing impulse in the face of overwhelming mortality was perhaps the most significant fact about the medieval response to plague. The physicians who remained in plague-stricken cities when others fled, and some did remain, their presence documented in the chronicles of the period, continued to apply the treatments available to them, knowing that those treatments were not working. Then, those treatments were not working, knowing that the mortality around them was evidence of the inadequacy of evidence of the inadequacy of everything they knew. The monks who tended the sick in the monastery infirmary continued to bring their clay jars of herb preparations and their prayers to the bedsides of the dying, the two things inseparable in their practice as they had always been. The cottage healer continued to prepare her betony and feverfew to steep her herb water in the clay pot near the embers, to lay cool linen cloths on fevered foreheads, because these were the things she knew how to do, and doing them was better than doing nothing, and doing nothing was not something she was capable of. The evening light faded over the monastery garden, the sky above the garden wall, moving through the pale grey gold of late afternoon into the deeper grey of approaching dusk. The smell of wormwood drifted on the cooling air, its bitterness a constant, the smell of medicine itself. In this world, the smell of trying. The rue spread its blue-green leaves in the fading light, its sharp smell releasing in small increments as the temperature dropped and the dew began to form on the broad surfaces of the elder leaves. The garden was quiet. The bells of the monastery marked the hour, their sound moving out across the garden, and beyond the wall, into the landscape beyond, where the village lay in its own quiet, its shutters still closed, its thresholds still strewn with bitter herbs, its households still waiting in the particular silence of a world that had learned, through the hardest possible experience, that some things could not be cured, only endured, only witnessed, only accompanied with whatever care and prayer and imperfect medicine the living had available to offer the dying. The wormwood and the rue continued to grow in their raised beds as the darkness deepened over the garden. Their smell was the last thing that remained distinct in the evening air, bitter and persistent and quietly present, the smell of a world that kept trying, that kept tending its gardens and steeping its herbs, and offering what it had, even when what it had was not enough. The garden held its silence. The monastery bells fell quiet. And the night settled over the medieval world with the same patience it had always brought, unhurried, complete, and full of the slow, enduring work of mourning. The cold of the church floor came up through the stone itself. It was a cold that had nothing to do with the temperature of the air, a deeper cold in the temperature of the air, a deeper cold, the cold of earth compressed into dressed limestone, over centuries of quarrying and cutting and laying, a cold that had been accumulating since the building was first raised, and that no amount of human warmth had ever entirely displaced. To step onto that floor in the early morning, before the first candles had been lit, and before the breath of the congregation had begun its slow work of warming the interior, was to feel the ground itself pressing upward against the soles of the feet with a weight that was almost geological, the weight of permanence, of something that had been here before any living person and would remain long after. The village church at early morning existed in a state of suspended transition between the darkness of the night just past and the pale light that would come with the day. Just past and the pale light that would come with the day, between the silence of the empty building and the murmured prayers that would fill it within the hour. The small windows set high in the stone walls admitted the first grey light of dawn in narrow shafts that fell across the floor at low angles, illuminating the dust that moved in the air above the cold stone and casting long pale rectangles across the worn surface below. The light at this hour had no warmth in it. It was the light of early northern mornings, flat, diffuse, the colour of old linen, and it fell on the interior of the church with an impartiality that made everything it touched look equally ancient, equally still. The smell of the church was the smell of centuries of use, compressed into a single atmosphere. Beeswax candles had burned in this space through every season of every year since the building was consecrated, and their smell had settled into the stone and the plaster and the wooden fixtures with a permanence that no cleaning could remove. Old incense, the resinous smoke of frankincense and myrrh burned at every mass and every feast day, had done the same. Its complex, slightly sweet, had done the same. Its complex, slightly sweet, slightly bitter smell layered through the beeswax, and beneath it the cold mineral smell of the stone itself. Damp was present, too, the particular damp of thick stone walls that absorbed moisture from the ground and released it slowly into the interior air, a smell that was neither unpleasant nor pleasant, but simply present, as permanent and as unremarkable as the cold of the floor. The painted saints on the plaster walls were the most vivid presences in the interior. Their colours deep red and ochre yellow, and the particular blue made from ground lapis that appeared in the robes of the Virgin had faded from whatever brightness they had possessed when first applied, settling into the muted, slightly dusty palette of old pigment on old plaster, their surfaces absorbing the candlelight rather than reflecting it, giving the figures a quality of depth that was partly optical and partly something harder to name. They looked out from the walls with the calm, direct gaze of figures who had been looking out from these walls for generations. His stars foreknow, who had received the prayers of the sick and the frightened and the grieving for as long as anyone in the village could remember, and whose painted eyes held in them the accumulated weight of all that looking and all that receiving. Each saint occupied a specific territory of suffering. This was not metaphor or approximation. It was the precise, practical geography of sacred medicine, as specific in its organization as the shelves of clay jars in the monastery infirmary. Saint Blaise, depicted holding the iron combs of his martyrdom, was the protector of those suffering from throat ailments. His feast day in February marked the blessing of throats with crossed candles, a practice performed by the priest on behalf of the congregation as a preventive measure against the winter illnesses that most commonly affected the throat and chest. Saint Apollonia, shown holding the tooth extracted from her during her martyrdom, was invoked for toothache, one of the most common and most debilitating pains of the medieval world, and small votive offerings left at her image in churches throughout Europe testified to the frequency with which her intercession was sought. Saint Lucy, her eyes depicted on a plate before her, was the protector of those with eye ailments, her name invoked when inflammation or infection threatened the vision that was essential to every form of labor. Saint Sebastian occupied a prominent position on the walls of many churches in the post-plague period. His bound figure, the arrows embedded in his flesh, his face turned upward with an expression that was simultaneously suffering and composed. He had become, through the experience of the Black Death and its aftermath, one of the most widely invoked protectors against epidemic disease. His image present not only in churches, but in small carved or painted forms kept in households, placed near the sick, carried on the person during periods of plague fear. The logic of his protection was rooted in the visual correspondence between the arrows that pierced his body and the sudden, penetrating onset of plague, the disease that struck without warning, from an invisible source, with a randomness that felt like the arrows of an unseen archer. To pray before his image was to place oneself under the protection of a figure who had endured exactly that kind of assault and had survived it, whose body had received the worst and had not been destroyed. The stone font near the entrance of the church held holy water, water that had been blessed by the priest in a formal liturgical act that transformed its physical substance into something understood as genuinely different from ordinary water, possessing properties that ordinary water did not possess. The font itself was carved from a single piece of stone, its interior worn smooth by generations of hands dipping into it, its outer surface carved with simple geometric patterns that had been cut when the church was new and had been slowly softening ever since under the hands that touched them in passing. The water in the font was cold, always cold, the stone keeping it at the temperature of the earth below the floor. The floor, and it was used in a range of healing contexts that extended well beyond the formal liturgical purposes for which it was primarily intended. It was carried home in small ceramic vials to be given to the sick, applied to the foreheads of those with fever, used to wash wounds, given in small quantities to those whose illness had a spiritual dimension that the household healer's herbs could not address. Blessed oil was another physical substance of sacred medicine, carried in small ceramic vials that were kept in the sacristy and dispensed by the priest for use in the anointing of the sick, the formal sacrament of extreme unction that accompanied the approach of death, but also the less formal application of blessed oil to the bodies of the ill as a form of treatment that was simultaneously medical and spiritual. The oil was olive oil, imported at considerable expense to northern European communities where the olive did not grow, its rarity giving it a value that was both practical and symbolic. Applied to the skin of the sick person, it was understood to carry the blessing of the Church into direct contact with the suffering body. The sacred substance touching the afflicted flesh, the boundary between the spiritual and the physical, dissolving in that contact into something that was simply care, simply the attempt to help. The relics housed on the church altar occupied the highest position in the hierarchy of sacred medicine. A relic might be a fragment of bone from a saint's body, a piece of cloth that had touched a holy person, or a sacred site, a small quantity of earth from Jerusalem, or any of the countless other physical objects that had been authenticated by the Church as possessing genuine spiritual power. They were housed in reliquaries, containers of precious metal and carved stone, sometimes shaped to suggest the body part they contained, sometimes elaborately decorated with enamel and gemstones in a visual language that communicated the value of what was held within. The reliquary on the altar caught the candlelight on its metal surfaces and held it in small, bright points that moved as the candle flame moved, the most visually dynamic object in the otherwise still and muted interior of the church. The touching of relics by the sick was a form of treatment as concrete and as seriously intended as the application of a herb poultice or the performance of a bloodletting. The sick person, or someone carrying a sick person's request, approached the altar and placed their hands on the reliquary, or on the cloth that covered it, or on the stone of the altar itself, if direct contact with the reliquary was not permitted, and in that contact sought the transmission of healing power from the saint's physical remains into their own suffering body. The logic was entirely coherent within the framework of medieval theology. The saints were not dead in any final sense. Their souls present with God and their bodies retaining the sanctity that their lives had imparted, and that sanctity was understood as a real, transmissible property that could act on the bodies of those who sought it with genuine faith. The shrines of healing saints drew the sick from considerable distances. Pilgrimages undertaken in states of illness that made the journey itself a form of suffering. The muddy roads of medieval England and the Low Countries traversed on foot or on horseback or in the slow jolting of a cart, the body already weakened by whatever condition had prompted the journey. The physical environment of pilgrimage was one of the most demanding in the medieval world. The wayfarers' shelters that dotted the pilgrimage routes were simple structures of timber and thatch, their interiors offering a straw-covered floor and a shared hearth fire and the company of other travelers, nothing more. The roads themselves were the roads of the medieval landscape, unpaved, subject to the same seasonal deterioration as the village streets, their surfaces churned by the traffic of pilgrims and traders and animals into the same deep mud that characterized every thoroughfare of this world. To undertake a pilgrimage in search of healing was to submit the body to additional hardship in the hope of divine intervention, an act that was simultaneously desperate and faithful, the desperation and the faith inseparable from each other. The arrival at a healing shrine was an arrival at a space that had been shaped by centuries of accumulated petition. The walls and columns near the shrine were hung with ex votos, votive offerings left by those who had sought healing and believed themselves to have received it. Wax figures modeled in the shapes of body parts were the most common. A wax leg, a wax hand, a wax eye, a wax eye, a wax eye, each one representing the afflicted part of the body of a specific person who had prayed here and had recovered, or whose family had prayed here on their behalf. Crutches hung from the walls, the walking aids of those who had arrived unable to walk without them and had left them behind as evidence of their recovery, their wooden surfaces worn smooth by the hands that had gripped them through months or years of use before they were surrendered to the shrine. Small linen bundles containing written prayers, folded and tied with cord, accumulated in baskets near the altar. The accumulated offerings of generations gave the shrine a particular visual texture, dense, layered, the evidence of countless individual acts of hope pressed together into a collective testimony to the human need for healing and the human willingness to travel any distance in search of it. The monastery infirmarian moved through his long stone room with his clay jars and his prayers in a practice that made no distinction between the two. He was a monk before he was a healer, and his healing was an expression of his monastic vocation, the care of the sick understood as a form of service to God. The herb preparations and the poultices and the coulisses and the cool linen cloths, all performed within a framework of prayer that surrounded and permeated every act. He prayed before he prepared a medicine, and after he administered it. He prayed at the bedside of the sick as he applied the herb steeped compress to a fevered forehead. The prayer and the medicine were not separate activities, performed in sequence. They were aspects of a single act, the act of care, which in this world was always simultaneously physical and spiritual. The herb garden he tended was tended as an act of devotion, as much as a practical medical resource. The Benedictine rule that governed his daily life made no distinction between the labor of the garden and the labor of prayer. Both were forms of service. Both were expressions of the same fundamental orientation toward God and toward the community that God had placed in his care. The raised beds of medicinal plants were laid out with the same care and intention as the illuminated manuscripts produced in the scriptorium, ordered, purposeful. Each element in its proper place, the whole reflecting a belief that the natural world was a text written by God, and that the careful reading of that text through observation and cultivation and use was itself a form of worship. The smell of the garden, wormwood and rue and hyssop and elder was the smell of this devotion made sensory, the smell of a practice that held the physical and the spiritual in a single, undivided attention. The church at night was a different space from the church at morning. The pale grey light of dawn had been replaced by the deep darkness of the interior, broken only by the single candle burning before the painted image of the saint on the wall, a small flame in a large darkness, its light reaching only a few feet in any direction, before the darkness reasserted itself and the rest of the interior disappeared into a blackness that was complete and absolute. The candle had been placed there by someone who had come to pray. Someone who had come to pray. Someone whose need was urgent enough to bring them to the church after the ordinary hours of worship had passed, whose illness or fear or grief had driven them through the cold night air, to this cold stone space, in search of something that the ordinary world could not provide. The candle was their presence made visible, a small flame standing invisible, a small flame standing in for the person who had lit it and left it burning, a physical expression of a prayer that continued in their absence. The cold air of the church at night carried the smell of extinguished incense, the particular smell of incense that has been burned and has gone out, which is different from the smell of burning incense, more muted and more complex, the resinous sweetness still present, but quieter, settled into the stone and the plaster and the wooden fixtures like a memory of the day's worship. The smell of old stone was beneath it, the mineral cold of the floor and walls, the particular quality of limestone that had been dressed and laid and inhabited for centuries, a smell that had no precise equivalent in any other context, and that was, in its own way, as specific and as evocative as any of the herb smells of the cottage or the monastery garden. The two smells together, old incense and cold stone, were the smell of the church at night, the smell of a space that was simultaneously very old and very present, that held the past in its walls while remaining entirely available to whoever entered it in the current moment. The painted saint on the wall above the candle looked out from the plaster with the same calm, direct gaze that the saints had always held. The candlelight moved across the painted surface in small, slow variations as the flame responded to the slight movements of air in the interior, a breath, a draft from the door, the almost imperceptible circulation of warm air rising from the candle itself. These movements gave the painted figure a quality of animation that was not quite stillness and not quite movement, a quality that existed in the space between the two, and that the candlelight created wherever it fell on a textured surface. The saint's painted eyes held the light and released it in small increments as the flame moved, and in the darkness of the church at night, this movement was the most alive thing in the room. The boundary between medicine and prayer, between the body and the soul, simply did not exist in this space. It had not been drawn yet. The drawing would come later, with the gradual separation of natural philosophy from theology, with the development of anatomy and chemistry, and the germ theory of disease, with the long, slow process by which the physical and the spiritual came to be understood as separate territories governed by separate kinds of knowledge. In the village church at night, with the single candle burning before the painted saint and the cold of the stone floor pressing upward through the soles of the feet, that separation had not happened. The person who knelt here was a body and a soul together, suffering in both dimensions simultaneously, seeking help from a source that addressed both dimensions simultaneously. The prayer offered here was not a supplement to medical treatment or a replacement for it. It was medical treatment, the most complete form of treatment available in this world, because it addressed the whole person rather than any single aspect of their condition. The wax ex-votos hanging near the altar caught the candlelight on their pale surfaces. A wax hand, a wax foot, a small wax figure representing a child, each one the residue of a specific act of hope, the physical form of a prayer that had been answered or that had been offered in the faith that it might be. Their surfaces were slightly dusty, slightly yellowed. With age, their forms simplified in the way that objects made quickly and cheaply are simplified, without the precision of craft but with the precision of intention, each one shaped to represent the part of the body that had suffered, the suffering made visible and offered to the saint as both petition and testimony. They accumulated over years and decades, each new offering added to the ones already present, the collection growing slowly into a dense, already present, layered record of the community's medical history, expressed in wax and prayer, rather than in the language of diagnosis and treatment. The cold of the church floor continued its slow upward pressure through the stone. The single candle burned before the painted saint, its flame small and steady in the darkness, its light reaching the painted eyes and the pale wax offerings and the worn surface of the altar stone, and no further. The smell of old incense and cold stone settled in the still air of the interior, unchanged by the hour or the season, the permanent atmosphere of a space that had been holding this particular combination of smells for as long as anyone alive could remember. The painted saints looked out from the walls with their calm, receiving gaze, available as they had always been, available as they had always been available. Their painted presence a point of contact between the suffering of the body and whatever lay beyond the cold stone walls of the building that housed them. This was the other half of medieval medicine, not the herb garden or the bleeding bowl or the clay pot of Bethany water steeping near the embers, but this, the cold floor, the candle light, the painted saint, the prayer offered in the darkness by a person whose body was failing them and who had come here because here was where the full extent of available help resided. The two halves were not in competition. They were aspects of a single practice, drawn from a single understanding of what the human being was and what illness meant and what healing required. The herb and the prayer were the same medicine, administered through different hands, addressed to the same suffering, offered with the same genuine, imperfect, entirely human hope. The candle before the painted saint burned lower as the night deepened, its flame unchanged in quality even as its fuel diminished. The small circle of light it cast remaining steady on the cold stone floor and the pale plaster walls and the calm painted face above. The smell of beeswax joined the old incense and the cold stone in the still air of the interior. The church held its silence with the patience of centuries. And in that silence, in that cold, in that small and steady light, the boundary between the body and the soul rested undisturbed, whole and quiet and at peace.